I see folks trickling in as we speak here. Very nice. So, folks, glad to see you. Welcome to our first solo event for this year. I am, for those of us who don't know, which is very few of us, Pete Fernbach, the director of the Writers Project and associate professor here. And what do we do, right? Every couple of weeks, we bring a stimulating writer or someone working in the industry. And this week we have poet Karen Rigby. 2 weeks on the 13th. We'll have memoirist and retired SUNY professor Richard Robeson reading from his book, The Boy from Nowhere. Many thank yous. As always, one is the everybody who curates the Visual Arts Gallery. As you can see looking around us, we have a nice venue for such things, right? Tell your friends and come grab free food and all of that. Also Chartwells who brings us the food, right? Today we will be celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month with poet Karen Rigby, who was born in the Republic of Panama in 1979. She now lives and writes in Arizona, where she's joining us from. Her debut book of poetry, Chinoiserie, was selected by Paul Hoover for a 2011 Sawtooth Poetry Prize and described by Booklist as poignant, powerful, and urgent, winning the kinds of prizes we all want to, okay? Her work has been honored by a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship, a Vermont Studios Center Fellowship, and an Artist Opportunity Grant from the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council. She's a 2023 recipient of an Artist Opportunity Grant from the Arizona Commission on the Arts. Her poetry is published in such well-known journals as the London Magazine, Poetry Northwest, the Oxonian Review, and Australian Book Review. In addition, she's read for venues including Rice University, Otis College, and the Greater Pittsburgh Festival of Books, and served as an AWP writer to writer mentor. A graduate of Carnegie Mellon and the University of Minnesota, Karen can now add SUNY Adirondack to the prestigious list of institutions that she's read for. Today, we'll be hearing from her second book of poetry, which most of us should have read. A slim black dress of a book, if I may, entitled Fabulosa, which has been praised as deliciously inventive in its linguistic unfurlings. It is a book that fibrillates with noir and glitz, and that is in conversation with a range of players from Dior to many film stars to painters like Hieronymus Bosch. Underpinning this collection is a keen interest in cinema, fashion, feminism, transformation, and textuality, from ars poetica to portmanteaus to acrostics. As the title suggests, Fabulosa is indeed absolutely fabulous, and we have a fabulous day to welcome a fabulous poet. Welcome, Karen Rigby.
Thank you, Peter, for that lovely introduction, and to all of you for joining us today. I find it very fitting that you're in an art gallery. I'm delighted by that, as much of my second book, Fabulosa, does cover the arts. And since this is part of a visiting writers symposium class, before I begin reading my work, I thought I would give you just one word that has been instrumental to how I've come to think about my work, and that might open up some thoughts for your own creative. And that word is chiaroscuro. It's an Italian painting term, and it refers to how you use light and dark to create contrast and depth. Now, perhaps the famous, easy example to think of is the Mona Lisa. Her face is very luminous, but the background and her dress are a bit darker. Now, poetry is another medium. It's not painting, but you can apply this idea of chiaroscuro all the same. So when a poem contains elements of both light and dark, and beauty and tension. That is what creates intrigue for me. It's what makes a poem compelling enough to come back to more than once, again and again. And for me, that interplay is very key. So I'll read you a few of my poems, and then we'll come back to this term to discuss it further. So the first poem is The Bar Suit, House of Dior, 1947. After the war, the wasp waist returns. Silk civility, a flag for romance, buttoned up jacket over pleated wool. Dior's vision of flower-like women is made in armor of glamour. Boning and yardage dazzle even now, a study in minimalist color, styled with Luke's hat and heels. Who doesn't love the regal criminal feel of leather gloves drawn past the wrists, terrifying in their strictured elegance? The year an editor crowns Dior's collection as the new look, the doomsday clock debuts on the cover of Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. The hand aims 7 minutes to midnight. Inside meringue and black couture, the spleen builds its own reactor. The future arrives in leonine steps. The future pivots. All of us witness a magician's wife home from the void, mouthing, it's nothing, nothing. Lemons in August. Mineral green Lisbons poised in the desert. I'm watching bees drunk with sun. A blistered leaf. Outside Phoenix, west of the municipal airport, cicadas drone in the mesquite's shade. All morning, the story on Reuters is bombing. I'm counting spent blooms on the vine. What good are the rosemary, orange jubilees scaling uniform walls? The lemons are courting monsoons, acidic, too soon to harvest, too late to save. I have nothing to add to the prophets. Lizard's pulse under jasmine, a lone contrail cuts the sky. The roses. Daily the beatitudes. Phosphorus struck in midnight air, flame cupped against rain. Dead-headed rose crowned with bees. Daily the cut arrangements, threaded in chain link, yellow tape dividing yesterday's gunfire from today's erasure. The roses are edged with bruises. The roses, American red, absorb the floodlit street. The roses hang night long in their jagged warning, scent the air with mottled plum, ask only to open once, prophecy, and die. So to come back to that term, chiaroscuro, you can see in these poems that there's a tension between the beauty of these botanical images and the harsher world events. Or in the first poem, kind of the beauty of this tailored, iconic bar suit by Dior set against a nuclear age. So in poetry, sometimes that balance between something that might be considered lovely, timeless, nature, contrasted with something that takes a bit more risk. It's placing those two items side by side in juxtaposition that kind of creates the moment of interest for your reader. It's something that's unexpected and hopefully thought-provoking. So I'll give you one more example of this type of poem. Now, I was born in Panama, and back in 1989, there was an invasion by the US known as Operation Just Cause, and its purpose was to remove General Manuel Noriega. And kind of in the run-up to that event, there was a lot of rioting and political tension. there had been a presidential election, and at the time, Noriega's supporters were in opposition to that, and they kind of assaulted the vice president-elect, and it was a public beating, and there happened to be an American photojournalist named Ron Haviv who captured that image, and it made the cover of Time magazine. And I remember as a child seeing that image, and it left an impression on me and kind of stayed with me. So you'll see that photograph being mentioned in this. Tangelo. Who doesn't love the portmanteau for tangerine and pomelo, or more like angel, tango, words for wilderness, how I like planting you, reader, in the thick of it. Also known as Honeybell, the peel lifting off like a capelet, the poem A Long Path, forgetting at the flesh, its obdurate slickness. Tangelo's not a metaphor for anything, which is why I love its simple divisions. The pith, a lacework, or dragnet. Where I'm from, Haviv's photo of a bleeding vice president, Guillermo Ford in his Guayabera, bludgeoned by gangs of the opposition, went viral months before the invasion of Panama. In 1989, savagery seeps through what we know. The Tangelo's no ritual, but it's as good as anything when it comes to hooking the past through the eye of the present. I can let lightning stitch my lip or forget a country with dead dictators. It's not the shape of a world that counts. It's the scent in my closed palm. So now I'd like to give you a little bit of practical application. So you have this term, chiaroscuro, which is also a literary term. You can look up more about it. But just a few little tips. If you happen to write fiction or memoir, for example, very often you'll hear this term in context of character development. No one is either all good or all evil. People are not that simplistic. So when you're thinking about revising your own work, you might consider how to give your characters this kind of nuance or shadowing. And when it comes to poetry, depending on your poem, you may not have a specific character, but you can still think of chiaroscuro very broadly. Now, every time I refer to light or beauty, it does not have to mean the topic. It's not that you're limited to writing about, floral imagery or beautiful paintings or things that are very aesthetic. Sometimes that beauty can come into the work in a much more subtle manner through the choice of language, the words that you're using, kind of the musicality of the line, the visual arrangement on the page. You can come at that idea of beauty in a sideways manner. Now, by the same token, when I talk about bringing some contrast into your poem, that doesn't mean that you need to resort to dark or harsh topics or global events or traumas or things that are kind of quite literally dark. They can simply mean taking a risk that you might not have otherwise, or giving things more complexity. So how does this play into revision? If you're taking a writing course, as you probably are, and I have, at some point, you'll receive feedback from your teacher or from your classmates, your peers, in kind of a workshop setting. And sometimes that can leave you wondering what to do. That you've written your work, you've poured your heart into it, and all of a sudden, there are 10 different opinions coming at you. How are you meant to revise? The advice that I would give you there is to think of revision as if you were a painter. It's not mainly about going in there to fix mistakes or to kind of work on a failure that didn't pan out or to correct something that's been broken. If you go into it with that mind frame, it's not very motivating. It might even be a little dispiriting. So if you think instead of going into revision as if you were a painter, then you can accept that your early draft was preparing the canvas. You're adding the primer, you're adding the gesso, you're doing a preliminary sketch, you're kind of getting your ideas down onto the page, and you're aware that you're not finished yet. But when you go back to revise, instead of thinking that, well, now I must fix the mistakes or address all of the critiques and opinions that I've been receiving, instead think of it as giving your work more layering, more depth. You're bringing more clarity to the work. You're giving your subject kind of a greater fullness to bring it into sharper relief, like a painter. And your goal is to bring that canvas to a level where it's ready to be shown and appreciated by someone else. If you think of it more as this kind of ongoing process to develop your final image, I find that to be much more rewarding personally, and it keeps your enthusiasm going through the process. So that's one component. Now, clearly I have this lifelong avid fascination with art, even though I'm not an artist. I think poetry is very multidisciplinary, and you can draw your inspirations from many sources. And for me, a lot of the times that does come from ekphrasis, which is a very kind of vivid and in-depth description, usually of an. So this next poem that I'll read you is called Lady with Glove, and it's inspired by a William Adolph Bouguereau painting, which is a portrait of a woman in a very elegant dress, but she's only wearing one glove, which I found very intriguing to kind of imagine why that might be the case, what was happening kind of off the canvas that we don't know about, what's the behind the scenes story. So that's kind of a fun little exercise you can do, is to just imagine what was going on in the painting. So here we are. Lady with glove. Color of ginkgo, maybe citron. Puffed sleeves, I notice first. Then her sideways, acid look. An ungloved hand props up the other gloved hand. Whether she's set to take the lone glove off or roll the missing one on, it's all invitational. Her blank décolletage. Picture the coup, the lure of unfinished action. No necklace, no background, except for the black sky or unlit parlor. Who knows where this is happening? I'm doing what history warns us not to, inserting myself in the frame so that her bloodless smile has little to do with neoclassical beauty, but the second before or after a crime. She regrets nothing. I regret less and less. In a parable of love, a brute steps into an orchard, doesn't come back. Once, a woman with opaline skin wore a malarial dress, fingers cocked like a gun. Whether she took the lone glove off or rolled the missing one on, the painting is fabling a crosswind in the trees. Now, I like to think of art as being very all-encompassing. It's not only fine art that you might find in a museum, but there are other arts also. So these next poems will cover some of these, including figure skating, and we'll come back to fashion again, and even television drama. All of these can be considered. So this next one, to Johnny Weir on I Love You, I Hate You. This was an Olympic figure skate in Vancouver. Transgression isn't hot pink courting down the center of your chest as much as the articulated pose, each muscle frozen in exuberance. The AP photo I love for your green-eyed envy of nothing and no one, elbows out, fingers splayed in sheer black gloves. The instant I think you know each sequence is obsession honed to art, each edge a fretwork left on ice. It isn't the single tassel, also pink, no apology, or the oil slick corset, but how performance masks the hours. The sound of blades beneath the music, the Colosseum breathless at the next jump. It isn't a boy beginning to dream in Quarryville, a cornfield swarmed in snow, but the speed of desire. Each clockwise spin, each gesture a spiked rose. When de Blasio's rumba turns, I think of nights I woke in Pittsburgh alone, dogwood beginning to open, the avenue stippled in orange light. I wanted nothing and everything. In that brick pre-war apartment, I lived through seasons of no answer. The end of grief is the beginning of fire, as when the last note sunders air. This next poem takes its inspiration from a British TV drama. It's about a fictional news show called The Hour, which you can kind of think of as being similar to 60 Minutes or various news programs. It's set during the 1950s, where at that time that format would have been novel. And one of the main characters is Freddie Lyon, who is a reporter. Watching Freddie Lyon in The Hour, I think about wiry Sangfroid and how my favorite TV men are rebels with devil-may-care hair, chip on a shoulder, cloak and dagger. The draw about misfits who love without being able to say, and so resort to barbed lines, is that we're all Freddie, too obstinate in a borrowed tux. I like that certain petulance, full of confidence, played by Ben Whishaw, just as I like Belle Rowley, his BBC producer, played by Roma Lakarai, whose tailored columns are dynamite in a bell jar. I get the reserve, which I suffer, whether it comes from a British ancestor who left me with the plainest surname, or whether I'd have come by indirectness anyway. In 1950s London, Freddie traces the murder of a debutante, and while it's never equivalent, I know a little about trying to reconcile pain with what you later learn, how obsession molts and returns, the same idea shedding as it goes, each time more glittering, so that at last the snake is the spy in the nest you thought your own. What do we owe memory? Freddie's dead friend haunts him, even as Hungary and the Suez stain the reels. About getting the truth right, I've spent my life wanting answers. Why one body's a message while another is silenced? What happens after news that stays news grows cold? I thought everything mattered. Nobody heard. I, too, mistook the work salvo for self. One more ekphrastic. Derby hats. Cartwheel hats, feathers and fascinators at Churchill Downs, each one a ringed planet. Give me the black picture hat. Danger slung over one eye, a hat to stop thoroughbreds in their paddocks. Not the ay caramba hat, loud as a multiplex, or the upbeat Breton in pastel straw, but the milliner's best fabulosa hat, paired with elbow-length gloves. You know the one, Gloria Swanson's poolside brim taking its place in the sun. Not the veiled pillbox, revival peach baskets, buckets, or cloches. I want the glamorous panther skulking right in the center of the grandstand. The silk funereal hat adorned with nothing at a lethal pin. The merciless hat, the damned hat blocked on a wooden mold shaped to midnight perfection. Hat a villainous wears on coastal drives. I want the Hollywood hat to motor in, the hat they'll book me in. Now I'll read you the book's opening poem, which is an Ars Poetica, usually a poem in which the poet is going on about some aspect about poetry. So in this, I play with persona and you'll see what I mean. Why my poems arrive wearing black gloves, like twin gauntlets set on the margin. Enter the female assassin, the screwball debutante, noir and glitz mixed in one bad throwback to an age when dahlias bold anyone who breathed them. My poems arrive wearing satin or suede to haunt you when they leave no trace. I've watched a man pull off his gloves with his teeth. The trick to undoing the wolf behind the saint is to make a slow-mo invitation of. Because there's never a plot unless one of us goes missing. That's me at the aerodrome and you boarding a custard plane. Now fly a desultory wind before you vanish. That's the tension we need. I love an overblown image, a drawer full of hands wave in a solemn motorcade. My gloves pantomime mood so thick you could ladle gravy. About my first book, a critic wrote, I'm a little bored with the aesthetic. That isn't damning, what is? My poems wear black to turn the dials and bag the ice in the director's cut. I'm driving the hairpin curve when the camera rolls back to show you looking louche but alive. You were always in on it. A poem is a diamond heist. Tell the critic no one watches a woman enter a room to look at her hands, just like no one's reading this poem to picture my life. Let a black glove peel down the avenue of my arm. What wouldn't you do? Now, one more poem, going back to my upbringing in Panama. Not the ghost of a rose. Not the ghost of a rose, not the lily scissoring water in its milk glass, not the icy sidewalk, half a world from home, that petals orange and blue as butane, blossoms scented with violence. Each spring, the bird of paradise cuts my window. I remember the country I loved without love, a blade of grass greener in revision, so that jungle bisecting the city wasn't the obsidian kingdom I drove by in silence, but a brushstroke in high wind. I once believed the mouth of a tiger, province the lost inhabit. Nothing populates memory. I left a republic for a northern city. I swallowed a river of stone. Now, one last poem. It's another Ars Poetica that goes back to that beginning idea I spoke about chiaroscuro and kind of playing with mixing light and darkness. Why my poems refuse daylight. Pinpricks on water, celluloid glare too paradisical on the retina. It's not natural for my poems to roll up on a butter gold vista and idle without a single cumulus. There's got to be a violin, tension like a knife thrower, weighing its target split second before it hits clear above the eyes. What's there to contemplate if everything's explainable? I like it when the vision's so weird it grows fur. If you want immaculate syntax, It won't happen. But I can serve glamour with the best of them, no gimcrack. My poems hunt shadow in the folds. Madam X dusted in lavender powder, persimmon stacked in a blue bowl. Everything in art is gesture. I can't save you from whatever's next, but if you're listening for the sound a house makes when the locks fall, this is for you with your stung heart. Thank you. I'd like to turn it back to Pete, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. I think I speak for everybody when I say we've learned a lot and had a good time already. So I guess I will try to direct people up here because the audio goes through the laptop we have at the front here. And of course, I've got lots of things to say as my class is learning about, but I guess I would love for others to interact as well while we have her, right? Does anybody want to come on up through the audio and ask something? Hope, here we go. Hope the poet, come on up.
Thank you for reading with us today. Really appreciate you doing that. I see that you toy with a lot of nature as like the lightness. Do you also find yourself ever talking about the darkness of nature?
That's a provocative question, and I can't say that I have.
Okay.
The darkness for me tends to come more through thinking of urban environments in various poems that I haven't read that are in the book, but maybe even in that Johnny Weir poem that I read, where it starts to conclude with this memory of living in a Pittsburgh apartment alone, and here's the dogwood beginning to open and the avenue stippled with orange light. So for me, the darkness kind of tends to come through urbanity. I've lived in cities on various occasions, in Pittsburgh and in Minneapolis, and that's where kind of the grittiness or the heaviness starts to play.
What do we have in mind as the darkness of nature, Hope?
Well, I was just thinking there's a lot of beauty in like flowers, but there's animals and everything, but there's darkness there too. There's like the cycle of life of death ultimately, or everything. I don't know. I thought, I saw a lot of your lightness, and I was just wondering where the darkness of, nature and flowers and kind of contrast there. I was just curious about that.
Well, that is a great question. And now that you've clarified that a bit, I think a lot of my poems often include fire. It tends to be a very potent and intense force, which can be destructive if you think of wildfire, but also creative if it's been kind of honed and contained for a purpose. So in that aspect, a little bit of darkness of nature.
Sorry, I was kind of vague with my questioning, but that's
no, it's great.
all I really wanted to know about was how you toyed with that darkness too.
That's great. Okay. All right. Anybody else, or should Mr. Neal? Neil Herr, a playwright who will be on display like you, Karen, in a few weeks.
Hi, Karen. I write musicals. I used to be a professor here for 14 years, and I love these poetry readings, and you read them very well. I haven't read your book. I just heard it for the first time, the few poems you've read. So a couple of things occurred to me, and I had some questions. One is that it seems like a lot of the subject of your poems are objects, and then you sort of strive to make them theatrical. Is that fair, or is that just off the wall reaction from someone who writes musicals?
That is very fair. And I think a good portion of that comes from kind of my background. Like, I took writing courses back in the late 90s. And at that time, one of the ideas that was kind of really presented to us was William Carlos Williams. He's got this little phrase about no idea, but in things. And I think at that time it was meant to kind of steer us from being too abstract and to kind of really focus on imagery and sensory detail and how to be very tactile about your writing, which is kind of a very common lesson to receive in a beginner course, that you do want to be very specific. But I've always loved that, and it's always stayed with me, that it's by writing through these kind of intermediary subjects, if you will, whether it's art or a flower or an object or something that's very concrete, that's how you arrive at getting towards something deeper. It's also kind of like that familiar quote by Emily Dickinson about tell all the truth, but tell it slant. So rather than going direct for whatever the underlying subtext might be, whether it's, a personal subject or a political event or something in the larger world, instead of just aiming there directly, I tend to approach it at a slant, which is through that object, whether it's, lemon trees or a tangelo or Dior's bar suit. It's having that kind of concrete, ready-made, if you will, image there allows me to kind of explore it. And it's in the process of going through the description that then I tend to arrive at what the poem's ultimate meaning. So to answer your question, yes, objects do play a very strong.
Thanks. So one object that really caught my ear and will stick with me for a long time is on your poem about the various hats. I don't know the name of it. I think you began with a derby saying it was like a ringed planet, which I imagine you meant Saturn, or it could be Saturn. And I've never thought of a hat like Saturn or hats having the same shape as Saturn, but that is a wonderful jump to make. And it just is rich with all its reverberations of what that can mean. I love hats. I have hats all over my house. And also, it also kind of gets back to that theatricality. So do you plead guilty to that as well, that it kind of, you inhabit the objects with a drama character?
Yes, that Derby Hats poem. Very often there are all these kind of horse races where the women show up with these magnificent, kind of flamboyant, really, really fascinating to me hats. I love hats too. But yes, I think that theatricality is fair, because for me, a lot of poetry is also a kind of heightened persona. In real life, I might be a quieter person, but once it comes to the page and to poetry, then I can kind of dramatize and make things a bit grander or larger than life. That's part of the playfulness and fun.
Okay, last question, which is most of your poems that you read anyway were very short. Some are long. How in the world do you know when a poem is finished? And I've never figured that out when I'm reading them or hearing them. Many lines could have been the ultimate, and yet they're not. So I'll just leave that with you. And thank you so much. I'll go home and wear some of my Saturn hats. So,
To answer that question, how do you know when a poem is finished? I think a lot of it is instinctive for me. After many decades, I've come to a point where I kind of know if I've exhausted something to the extent that I can. A lot of times in writing, you'll hear that something's never finished, it's merely abandoned. There's some truth to that, but I think just as you work through your own process, at some point you will have an idea of where to go.
All right, wonderful. Who's next? We have Quinn. I see Quinn coming on up.
Hi, I wanted to say I admire in your writing how you hi, can you hear me right first?
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. When you're bridging between what you said between like light and dark, you start to get microscopic, or like the composition of something, whether it's like acidity, you mentioned like the tonics, or you include celluloid. And I think I don't know, I like when you break down and you get larger and you come out the other end in the dark. My question is, though, it's not relevant to that. In Panama, I know that the conflict that you mentioned is continued today. And I was curious how that impacts your own notions of identity. Because I know here, even if you don't have like nationalistic pride living here, we're told that it's important to live here and we're raised that way. But I know that, but Panama's been kind of divided between the US and China since the 80s and like way before, just because as a trade route. Does that impact your own the scale of your identity or how you view yourself at all?
Well, I'll go about this in kind of a roundabout way. I think no country is a monolith. So just as there are many Panamanians in Panama, there'll be many Americans in America, and everyone will have their own experience of what that means, of how that's affected them, of how it plays into their life. There's no singular person who can somehow represent the totality of everything. So in that regard, when it comes to poetry, I generally don't think about matters of identity or background or where I'm from. I'm thinking about the poem. So if those aspects do happen to come out in a fragment, like through some historical topic or some gesture toward a background theme, it's always in service of the art and tends to arise kind of subconsciously or naturally without having been deliberately planned. I tend to think more that we should be, well, more globally minded, I should say. It's fine to have a certain pride in where you've come from. That's perfectly valid. It's your life experience, it's what you've lived, but you also have to remain open to kind of realizing that whichever country you happen to be from is not the center and is not everyone else's experiences. I guess that's how I would.
Do you have any advice on how you yourself like absolve your own identity from your writing and you're able to focus on the outside more than yourself?
Well, I would say that if you're a writer, it's kind of inevitable that no matter what you're writing about is going to reveal some facet of yourself, of your thinking, of your various influences, books that you've read, material you've absorbed, of your personal experiences. So even if I'm writing about a topic that on its surface looks like it's not related to me, such as, a bunch of derby hats or, lemon tree or whatever, even if it seems that could apply to anyone, it's the language that kind of reveals who I am, because the word choices that I'm going to choose won't necessarily be the ones that someone else would choose. And in that regard, I think everything that you write is invariably going to reflect some facet of yourself. And it's something to embrace. And it's something that you can either work with or work against, but it's part of the practice.
Yeah.
We have a Freddie first and then a Damien and a Wind, perhaps. Freddie first. Here's Freddie.
Hi, thank you for joining us today, and I enjoyed hearing you read poems. In particular, on to Johnny Weir on "I Love You, I Hate You." I always get caught up on like these small details in poems and just literature. It says, "It isn't the single tassel, also pink, no apology." What do you mean by also pink, no apology?
Okay, so that figure skating performance was back in Vancouver, and the costume that he was wearing happened to have a pink tassel and like pink lacing and kind of these dramatic frills and sequins like figure skating tend to do. So what I meant there by no apology is that it is a performance. It is larger than life. I mean, figure skating does tend to have all those sequins and the sparkles and costuming and the details. And from my understanding at that time, that might have seemed a bit controversial. Not everyone agrees with how, male figure skaters present themselves in these costumes. It's not to get into that topic, but no apology means that there's this kind of confidence and to this entire performance, regardless of the costuming. It's also a very athletic sport, and it takes an enormous amount of dedication. And regardless of what we think about particular individuals or this or that surrounding background issue, you have to respect and admire just how difficult a figure skate is. Just a few minutes long, and they have to work in all of these components and really hone it to perfection. And for me, that's the real transgression. Not that it's a pink costume, but the fact that someone kind of dares to have this excellence, which we should respect and we should admire. There's a line in there about the various hours, right? We tend to see the kind of glossy finished result, but we seldom think about just how many hours it took of sweat and of falling over and of making mistakes and getting up again and doing it again. And that for me was the heart of the poem. I have tremendous respect for any art that requires this kind of level of persistent daily dedication. I hope that answers.
Thank you.
Next, I see Damien coming up.
Hello. So to start off, I just wanted to say that one of the things I like about your poetry is kind of the elegance, both in the language used and just the imagery. I find it really does pull you in. Not really relevant to my question, but I did just want to add that. Kind of in line with some of the questions that Quinn had. Or let me back up. Another thing I liked was in Tangelo, you kind of got into the history of Panama, and like I was saying, it kind of pulled me in to where I went on a whole Wikipedia like deep dive on like Guillermo Ford and the Dignity Battalion and stuff like that. It was very interesting, and my question kind of pertains to Panama, or I guess your experience coming from Panama to America. Was there anything that like was a bit of a culture shock to you, or was it kind of just like, I'm here now? Or how was that like for you?
Well, a bit of my background is that I am partly Panamanian. My father is partly American. My grandfather is from Pennsylvania. And I did go to American schools in Panama, so all of my schooling was English. So in that sense, I kind of had visited the United States many times over the summers, partly American by dint of birth of my father and my grandfather. So I kind of already had some of those cultural experiences or touchstones. I grew up with a lot of same television series that would have been shown at that time. I had a lot of kind of the various kind of cultural contexts already. But I will say that, and this is kind of silly, one of the things that did surprise me about coming to the States, I came to the States to go to college. So I was an undergraduate, I was in Pittsburgh, I had never seen snow. So that was a surprise for me. I thought it would be fluffy, and it was just disappointingly melting and icy. Something else that I remember was that I had never ridden a bus. I'd ridden a school bus, but not like a public bus on public transport. I'd never had the occasion to do so. So I came to the US, and I remember being like very anxious about when would my stop come up, and am I supposed to like ding the bell and get off now? What am I supposed to do? And I remember that sometimes I'd be like, oh, just forget it. And I would just ding the bell and get out early, which seemed better to me than missing the stop. Then I would just finish walking the rest of the way, which just seems kind of hilarious now. But that's one little thing that did.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as someone who rides the bus, starting off, it can be very anxiety inducing because like you said, like I've gotten off early plenty of times because I'm like, well, I don't want to miss it. And I've had to
Yes.
wait way longer to get home or to wherever. So, but yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm sorry snow was so disappointing, but thank you. And thank you for sharing with us today.
Does Wind have a question? All right, I have a few, and maybe you guys can think of things as we move along here, right? Speaking of contrast, we have, lots of different kinds of phenomena, the US and Panama and derby hats and US invasions and things like that. And I guess I'm just wondering about the ethics that we bring to objects. So when we're talking about derby hats, or when we're talking about a US invasion, what kind of ethics do we bring to these things? And or should we remove that from questions in poetry, or how do we navigate it?
It's a profound question, and I think people will come to their own decisions about it. I know that sometimes there's discussions in poetry about the risk in somehow making trauma or terrible things too aesthetic, to the point where you've kind of made the work so elegant that it results in a kind of detachment from the reality of whatever it is that has occurred. And I think for this, I'll hand you one useful little tidbit that was given to me back in one of my creative writing courses. We were reading Pablo Neruda in the English translation, and there was one little moment, I can't recall which particular poem, that had to do with like the blood of the children ran through the streets like children's blood. That's a terrible paraphrasing since I don't have it in front of me. But my instructor's point at that time was that because what's being discussed is so incredibly heavy and kind of impossible to approach, that in that particular instance, at least the translator chose not to reach for a metaphor. He did not compare the children's blood to, I don't know, a blooming poppy or whatever. He didn't go in that direction of finding some way to soften the moment. So the comparison was exactly equal. It ran through the streets like children's blood. So that's one aspect. If you're writing about something that's kind of really momentous or brutal, you kind of do have to be careful about the language that you're going to choose to do so. And it's kind of up to the writer to decide if they're going to take that risk that another reader on the outside will misinterpret or take offense or disagree. But it's kind of a case-by-case decision of the type of poem that you're writing and how far you're willing to go. But you do want to be, like you use the word ethics, you want to be conscious of what you're doing, where you are not taking away from the reality of whatever it is that has happened. You don't want to make it so very aesthetic that it risks kind of having your reader become numb to it or detached. If the thing is difficult, then you should portray it as it is.
And just quick follow-up off the top of the head, can you think of other examples that either do that really well in your estimation or very poorly? Are there instances of like highly aestheticized trauma that you could think of, or artists that walk the line really well?
Let's see. In terms of walking the line really well, I'll give you the title of a poem. Ilya Kaminsky, a wonderful poet. He has a poem, I believe is titled "We Lived Happily During the War." And it's a poem that tends to make the rounds, on the internet whenever there's been a kind of catastrophic event. Now that poem does it well because it's very honest. Even the title will kind of reveal that to you. We lived happily during the war, not because we are indifferent or because we don't feel for all these things that are happening, be it on the newsreel or in a distant place. It's not immediately in our own communities. It's not that we are detached from it. It's kind of a complex poem in simple language that really conveys that kind of weight, that kind of double acknowledgement that we lived happily during the war, meaning we carried on with our daily lives. We went on doing what we were doing while this was happening someplace else, while simultaneously kind of having the heavy acknowledgement that being lucky enough to be out of it, that kind of has a weight to it also. So that's the one example I can think of that does things.
I think that's a great example. And sort of tangentially, in reading Fabulosa, the fascination with art is obvious, right? But we haven't spoken yet of what seems to be a fascination with crime as well. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how that weaves in and out of your work and, your thoughts on life in general, maybe.
Okay, so I'll be honest, a lot of this book was written over the course of many, many years. And it really began to intensify for me in terms of creating more poems for it during the pandemic, which is when a lot of us, for better or for worse, were binge watching. So that's where that comes from. There's a poem in the book that I didn't read about Endeavour, which is a British TV mysteries. The one that I did read, The Hour, even that contains a kind of crime. So it's not so much the fascination with the crime aspect in particular, just as this was the material that I happened to have in front of me that spawned an idea and inspired me. So it kind of goes back to that idea of ekphrasis, that it doesn't need to be, a painting, framed, gilded painting on the wall or a museum. The arts are much wider and much broader. There's no kind of like high art and low popular art. All of it is fair game for material. So that's one aspect. I just happened to be watching these things at the time when I needed to be generating poems. So nothing is ever wasted. Even if you're not writing, you still might get inspiration from it. And the other aspect is that I love reading. And as a kid, I grew up reading Agatha Christie all the time because it just happened to be in my household. So that kind of plays into it.
Nice. So I asked my class on the first day, right? We have a lot of my students here. And I think you've given us good writing advice already. I think the comparison with painting can do a lot to, remove the personal emotional reactions to criticism, things like that. So thought that was great. But I ask everybody of both either really good or really bad advice about writing that they've heard. And I'm wondering if anything else comes to mind, either the really good or anything that we should leave behind as writers. Good or bad writing advice?
Let's see. Okay, I'll give you some great writing advice that is not my own, and it's going to seem very obvious and very glib. I think I saw it on the internet. The advice was to open the document. And that was it. And the reason that's great advice is because there's so often this resistance to wanting to just get started, especially if you're in the middle of some kind of tangled knot that you're trying to work out and you find every reason not to do it. So the advice is just open the document, get started. In terms of advice that hasn't been so useful to me, very often you'll hear the advice to write every day. And my response to that would be that you don't have to. I understand why that tends to be given as kind of an advice. It's kind of so that you're against perfectionism. It doesn't matter. Just open the document, write down anything. At least you're getting something done. But for me, I don't write every day. And the reason for that is that I think of writing as a long accumulation. There is no hurry. I mean, unless, of course, you have an assignment due and there's a deadline, you've obviously got to meet that deadline. But, in general, if you're writing, you have an entire lifetime in which to work these things through. So if you're not a daily writer, like every day I'm going to write 1,000 words, if that's not the kind of mind frame that you have, that is okay, as long as what you are doing is still somehow feeding into reading other poetry collections, reading various books across topics, just going about your day, living your life. As you're doing all of the not writing, the subconscious part of you should be kind of gathering images. You're paying attention to what's out there and to what might be useful to you later. You're doing that kind of accumulating. So you don't have to write every day. But if you're being very kind of attentive and aware and doing the work of reading, by the time you do come back to the page, then ideally you've got some source material to be drawing from.
And how much would you say you do write? So how much per week, per month?
Well, I think I would be not the model for productivity. Definitely not. This second book of mine, it was a span of like a dozen years between this and the first. So for me, even if I write like 10 poems in 1 year, if those are 10 poems that I really believe in, then that was plenty. It's not measured by quantity or speed. It's whether the poem has met the bar, the kind of internal bar that I've set for myself. So even if I write, like the last thing I wrote, I'm working on a third book. I wrote this kind of 6-page poem that I've never done before. I've never extended a poem for that long, but that was a couple months. And I haven't come back to writing since then. So for me, it's really very kind of long, formative, gestative.
And nearing the end here, so I was going to ask you what's next. What kind of things are you working on that we might see in the future?
Well, I think for now I will be just working on individual poems and seeing how I might gather that into a third collection. But I am very loosely planning to write more about Panama, since I haven't up to this date. I think that's an important thing to note as a writer too, that sometimes the experiences that you've lived in the past aren't ready to be written about right away. It might very well take you many years to arrive at the point where you know how to approach the work. So there's a great benefit to time of not kind of writing right in the crucible of the moment of when things are happening. If you can get at it from a longer distance, I think that gives you a more mature perspective of your various life experiences and so forth. So I think now that I'm in my 40s, then at last, I think I'll go back to my next work.
All right, thank you very much, Karen. I think we had a amazing first event here, guys. All right. I'm gonna set my class free, and I'll get the paperwork and all that ready for you, Karen. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was a great lead off.
Thank you.